Afternoon, and welcome to the second session of our webinar on how governments can use data to tackle COVID-19. I'm Matt Ross, Editorial Director of the publishing house Global Government Forum, which serves civil servants around the world. In the first session, we broadly looked at the use of data on identified individuals and organisations to deliver services. This one would consider big data technologies, meaning in a very rough definition, the use of anonymised data sets to identify patterns informing policy design and service delivery. For example, governments could bring together anonymised data on citizens' movements from public transport providers, roads managers, aerial photography, maybe mobile phone operators to track levels of public mobility and then use that information to forecast new outbreaks or local economic impacts. Or they could use data from tax returns, local authorities and industry bodies to understand the differential impact of lockdown on various sectors of the economy, and thus build economic stimulus packages that meet industry's particular needs and circumstances. Meanwhile, aggregated data on hospital treatments, clinical research, infection control and lockdown policies can highlight effective prevention strategies and medical responses. So over the next 75 minutes, we will consider some of the ways in which data can be used to respond to COVID and the damage it's causing, and explore some of the skills, technologies and techniques required by governments to make full use of its potential. We'll discuss the obstacles that hamper government's progress and think about how they can retain the public trust that is essential to realising the potential here. Like the first session, this one will begin with short presentations from our panelists, and then we'll move on to questions. So if you have any questions for the panel, individuals or for everybody, please just click on the Q&A button at the foot of your Zoom window and type them in. I'll keep a careful eye on that. We'll try and save plenty of time for audience questions. I mean, we broadly aim to talk about big data applications in this webinar, but it's a vague dividing line, so your questions could be on a relevant topic. Before going any further, I just want to thank our knowledge partner Google Cloud, whose support enables us to offer this webinar free of charge to public servants. So let's trot through the panelists. Ronald Jansen is Chief of the Data Innovation and Capacity Branch in the Statistics Division of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations. Francisco Rodriguez, Head of the Digital Government Division in the Ministry of Presidency of Chile, that nation's central digital function. Mark Palmer is Head of Public Sector for Europe, Middle East and Africa at Google Cloud. Keksu Lin is Director at the Smart Nation and Digital Government Office, the central digital function in Singapore. And Alistair Campbell is Assistant Secretary for COVID-19 Data at the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet in Australia. So we will go through individuals' comments before returning to questions. And so let's start with Ronald.
Thank you, Matt, and a good day to all of you who are listening in. A big thanks to the Government Global Forum for kindly inviting me to be part of this panel. As Matt already indicated, I'm Ronald Jansen. I'm Assistant Director of the United Nations Statistics Division in New York, and I'm leading currently the work on data innovation and capacity development. I'm very happy to give you a quick overview of what we, and more broadly the statistical community, are doing in the area of big data and the COVID-19 response. In general, my office, the UN Statistics Division, supports the statistical community by developing global statistical standards and building statistical capacity in countries. In relation to the COVID-19 response, one of the things my office did was to collect and share guidance on how to ensure the operational continuity of data programs by the national statistical offices. and how to address issues of open and timely access to critical data needed by governments to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. On our website, we've also have made available quite a few COVID-19 related data sets, and you can access them if you like. How do we use big data for the COVID-19 response? I'll give first a little bit of a background. Since about 2014, we have a working group of experts from the statistical community looking into the use of big data for official statistics. Besides statisticians, we also have up to a few hundred experts from academia, civil society, and private sector working with us. This group explored, for example, use of satellite data for agriculture and environment statistics, scanner data for consumer price index calculations, mobile phone data for tourism, migration, dynamic population statistics, and the AIS vessel tracking for marine transport. Statistical agencies also started to set up their own big data centers, like in the Netherlands and in Korea, and data science campuses, like in the UK, Rwanda, and the United Arab Emirates, to improve active international data collaboration. The Office of National Statistics, or the Office for National Statistics of the UK, took the initiative a few years ago to build what we now call the UN Global Platform, which is a cloud-based collaboration environment for the statistical community. And on this platform, experts from around the world can actively work together on data projects using global data sets and advanced technology. Additional advantages of this are access to a network of experts and the speed at which you can start up new data projects, given that the cloud space and services are available. So this agility in setting up projects became evident when COVID-19 happened. Staff of the data science campus of ONS UK were already familiar with using the platform, and in a very short amount of time, they were putting together timely and relevant indicators to monitor the effectiveness of, the effects of COVID-19 in the UK. So ONS is, I see this as a front runner in informing its citizens about the situation in the UK through a weekly release of coronavirus and the latest indicator for the UK economy and society. The next release will come out tomorrow. Some of those indicators which they are putting out, they use big data sources. For instance, the estimation of weekly job vacancies, online prices of high demand products, and the daily port visits of all ships. Back to our global platform, given that the platform receives continuous feeds of the AIS vessel tracking, we can and are estimating port activity for about 1,200 ports around the world on a weekly basis. We show this on our website in a dashboard. It also includes some indicators for international passenger flights and detailed monthly trade figures. A lot of the work on big data and COVID-19 response concerns the use of mobile phone data, given that human mobility is one of the major factors in the spread of the disease. To mitigate the spread of COVID-19, governments have put bans on large gatherings, closed businesses and educational facilities, restricted international travel, and imposed mandatory quarantine. Mobile phone data can help to review and evaluate the effects of such measures. Within our network, we have institutes like Flowminder, Positium, and the World Bank. These institutes have used or using mobile phone data in partnership with national governments and the mobile network operators to produce indicators which monitor the effectiveness of government interventions. For example, the World Bank currently collaborates with the government of Zimbabwe using mobile phone data to identify how different mitigation scenarios could reduce impacts on the number of infections and hospitalizations at the district level in Zimbabwe, including modeling the implications of when and where the lockdown measures could be selectively eased. In a similar way, Positium has been working with the government of Estonia. Flowminder is working, among others, in Ghana and Haiti. Flowminder developed about 30 indicators to assist in monitoring effects of COVID-19 related measures. And those indicators are well documented and available on the website of Flowminder. And to the point of trust, Flowminder adheres very much to an open source and transparent business approach, fully compliant with privacy and data protection concerns and regulations. Let me finish, and maybe I can ask Maria with a few illustrations of big data applications. If we put up a few slides here. We go to the next slide. So this is a slide of the Global Working Group design. If we go to the next slide, this is just a quick overview of how mobile phone data have been used. This one was in Haiti. On the left side, before the government lockdown, we see the activity, the usual activity of mobility of the population. Then after the lockdown, the mobility and the way this was measured decreased by about 10 to 15% to the normal level. If I go to the next slide, this is the analysis done in Estonia, which looks at stay at home. So average amounts is around 18 hours stay at home. After lockdown measures, you could see that amount was going up to about 20 hours. So these are indications which could show the effectiveness of people actually restricting their mobility. Go to the next slide. This is a quick overview of some other measures related to some economic indicators. First one, which we work together with the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. They put out a lot of data on their website. This is one of them, which shows international passenger flights between 2019 and 2020 on a monthly basis. And you can see for April and May 2020 how this international travel came to about a complete shutdown. From about 1 million flights per month down to about 70,000. And the last one I'm showing here is port calls, the number of ships coming into international ports. This one in Eastern Asia. This one shows week by week how many ships made a port call. You could see, and this is the dip, which you see is in January, February of this year, where there was about a decrease of 50% in the number of ships coming into ports in Eastern Asia. I'll leave it at this. Last remark here is that most of these data fall in the category of experimental data. Statistical agencies have started to use more of this because they see that with this timely data, government policies can be informed immediately, and they can adjust policies in a very timely manner. I'll leave it at that. Back to you, Matt.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll move straight on from to Francisco.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this very important reflection, and thanks to the Global Government Forum for making this happen. Good morning to everyone. It's 11 a.m. here in Santiago, Chile, and I wanted to share some thoughts around what we've been doing and what have been the major questions around the pandemic and data. First, a quick overview of how we've organized. We've organized around pretty much, obviously, the health system and the health authority, and together with the police institutions regarding the control of mobility around cities. And the first challenge we had was around the platform, the design and the features of the platform that used to the police institutions work with for issuing their permits and their interaction, their digital services with society. It was a low availability platform, and we needed in 2 weeks to transform that into something that is of high performance, of high availability, and that could guarantee not only operation continuity, but also the data sets for the health authority that could make the analytics and the good decisions in terms of managing the pandemic. From that experience, one of our main takeaways is that we have, and there's still, for the good use of data, there's still a lot of work to do in terms of an architecture, a solid and robust architecture in terms of systems that are serverless, that are able to perform at a high availability, that are of course easy, more capable of integrating data sets, especially considering when the baseline are institutions that are organized in silos, and one of the things that has been also a big challenge are mainly the digital capabilities for institutions to run high performance systems and use the tools in the cloud that are available for unlocking the potential of big data, and a robust and a solid privacy law that, in the case of our country, is still in Congress, and that has been a huge issue for citizens that were not necessarily very aware of their digital rights or their digital privacy, but now since they've been locked down in their houses and forced to use to pretty much 24/7 connect to their digital devices, awareness grew a lot, and the topic of it, and also part of the baseline as well was low levels of trust with institutions. So that sets the bar really high in terms of the procedures and the standards of how we are processing that data and how we ensure this feeds public trust and it doesn't harm public trust. Another big issue is behind, further from tech, is the integration of systems, and system being, okay, there's a technical part, but the mindset of public servants really thinking on how to integrate systems and enable the flow of information, and in that sense, leaving the mindset of solving their systems, their problems in their silos, and I think that's also a huge issue of culture that we are just addressing, and that it's challenging because citizens have their phone on their hand, and they want they expect their problems solved in their mobile phones, and And in the other side of the coin, there's a state that has to change culture, has to change systems, and that's challenges that are not immediate, and that's a big leadership challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mark is next, if you may.
Thank you, Matt, and hopefully you can hear me fine. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. It's a very global audience. I'm sat here in my home office, as I have been for the past 4 or 5 months in southern England. And thanks for the introduction, Matt. I'd also like to thank everyone here representing governments who have responded so swiftly to help protect all of us citizens during the pandemic. It's been, well, an experience I hope we don't have to go through again in our lifetime. We in Google Cloud have worked with a number of public sector customers around the world during these very challenging times. But what's been interesting is that customers have demonstrated that really very, very rapid change is certainly possible when we're faced with these terrible situations and when there really is a need. Matt indicated, for example, in transport, obviously in healthcare, we've seen huge change in education in many settings, but also now in particular in areas like social welfare. So in terms of the inputs I saw from my customers around the region I serve, Europe, Middle East and Africa, most of the inbound calls we got in those early weeks were around those aspects, and more latterly around transportation and social welfare. You can go to the next slide, please. So this is our mission, and has always been our mission in Google Cloud, but really did come to the fore over the past few months, and we've started talking about it here, how to transform digitally through data-powered innovation. Certainly this pandemic has accelerated that, is what we've seen. Now as we enter, let's call it the recovery phase, let's hope it is a recovery phase, certainly with reduced budgets and concerns about new outbreaks, the effective use of big data, we believe, certainly will become ever essential to help address these issues. And so I set out by proposing that the essential ingredient, apart from the data itself, but to be able to leverage the power of big data at scale, is the provision of some sort of cloud platform. One that is both secure and, interestingly, open. I think you need both, and I'm sure there might be some questions about you have both secure and open at the same time, open in its architecture, but of course also with the necessary data protection controls, and that previous panelists have already touched on that. So cloud, the reason I say this is because cloud enables the agility, but also the business continuity and operations at huge, massive scale, but also has within it the tools for AI and machine learning. Within the Google Cloud, there's about 150 different software tools. It's not just about all the infrastructure. And you need those tools really to get those insights from the massive volumes of data, to collect the data, to look after the data, to gain the insights, to manage it, to back it up, and so on and so forth. And cloud really reduces the dependency on those large, complex, legacy, traditional systems integration projects. So let me give a couple of examples. In the few minutes I have left, if we can go to the next slide. Clearly, at the very early days, it was all about public health response. As the pandemic emerged, this was the priority. Organizations were faced with how do we collect data really quickly from many different sources, but also with the many data governance challenges from different stakeholders. Then once they had the data, they could perform analysis of that data to detect, evaluate, react, and manage risks posed to public health. So for example, the Australian government's Department of Health built a citizen-facing application. Now the citizens just see what they think is an app. Of course, under the surface of that application, no matter how they accessed it, real-time information and advice coming from all kinds of different data sources, but also it was two-way. Citizens were able to do self-reporting. Now, post that emerging crisis at the beginning, we have a huge data set, and the government there can now use that data set for further pandemic planning and ongoing analysis of how to react should a surge come back. A different example this time, but also equally important, at the same time we saw a lot of research institutions like Harvard Medical School suddenly go into overdrive looking at research. How could we find solutions to this disease? And immediately we had a lot of engagement with many global research organizations, providing them data sets via our healthcare APIs. APIs enable organizations disparately dispersed to be able to collaborate, communicate, and share data. We also deployed our famous search technologies to help research organizations make sense of these huge data volumes. So we saw those two tracks happening in the early stages of this. If I can go to the next slide, please, because we're now into this phase, disease monitoring and control. How can authorities, epidemiologists see how social distance is working? And I saw some examples from the previous two panelists. We also provide community mobility reports, which does use aggregated and anonymized data to chart movements trends in towns all around the world. It pinpoints movement trends and busyness in specific locations like transport hubs, retail, recreation, and so on. So governments and researchers can actually see how people are moving and how busy people are in a certain very defined region. The current question we are seeing a lot of is how to reopen public transportation safely. I mean, essentially there is a capacity problem in public transport. So if there is a 2-meter distance required, there are only so many people you can get on a bus or a train. So there is actually a fundamental capacity problem, which could probably only be dealt with by government policy. But in terms of the technology, today you can see busyness on things like Google Maps in stations. You can see their congregation, but the technology is there. If government agencies want to use this, this is really bringing Internet of Things, IoT, into action by collecting data from things like beacons, counters, cameras, ticketing machines, and so on, to really give a precise picture of busyness. If I can move to the next chart, because this is the final area, and this is around the social impact. And this is, we're seeing a lot of countries put very quickly in place safety nets, social welfare nets, for example, in unemployment benefits. And there are many examples where there were huge spikes in applications. We worked with the New York State Department of Labor and also the government in Madrid in Spain to really help manage those spikes, but also to collect that data and to be able to handle all those rush of inbound inquiries, literally in days of millions and millions of inbound inquiries in some countries. And that was a huge functional problem for those government organizations. But having worked with those two examples, put the cloud capabilities in place, not only can they handle the volumes, but also have collected the anonymized data that they can analyze going forwards. So if I go to the final slide then, in conclusion, from Google Cloud's point of view, we're certainly very proud to support these and many, many other public sector customers around the world with the platform and tools to really leverage the power of big data to help address this pandemic. Getting insights into this is really key. I love that point that Francesco just made around breaking organizational silos. And as he said, the citizen doesn't really care where the data comes from, or the business, or the clinician, or whoever it is. They just want to see the single view of the information that they get. So I think that is a big challenge, breaking down organizational silos. And thank you for listening to me. I very much look forward to answering any questions you may have later. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Mark. I'll just briefly, I would reiterate the point about writing in your questions. I have lots of questions which I can ask the panelists, but this is also a chance for the audience to put their questions directly. We had lots of questions in the last one, so just type them in the Q&A box. And meanwhile, we'll move on, if you may, to Sue Lin.
Hi, well, good evening from Singapore. Thanks so much for inviting me to this webinar. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to exchange our experiences with each other. I come from the Government Data Office, which is cited in the Smart Nation and Digital Government Office. We're actually a fairly new outfit. We were only set up sometime in October 2018, and our main mission is something quite I think you'll hear. It's quite familiar to all of us. It's really about propelling the digital transformation of the government using data and using data securely. So that's really a quick recap of our mission. But today, what I'll just share a little bit about is what we've been doing for COVID-19 and how we've been using data in that process. I don't think I don't think everything is purely big data, but I thought it's good to share our context, what we've been doing, and I think we can have a good conversation around it. So if we could go to the next slide. So it's just some background. Our response to how we manage COVID-19 has been quite multifaceted, and we've been rolling out measures on all different fronts. I think quite key to our efforts have been clearly the contact tracing and quarantine program that we have in place. It's really a key pillar of making sure that we identify people quickly, we're able to isolate them effectively, so that so that we can curb the transmission of the disease. And around that as well, of course, are the safe distancing measures, safe workplace management measures, etc. We have made it a rule that everyone has to wear a mask. If not, you will face a fine. And we do have safe distancing ambassadors. These are volunteers from different parts if they signed up for this job, who do go around the island and to remind people about making sure you keep your distance, making sure you carry out the requisite the practices to make sure that we can stop the disease from spreading further. And certainly, I think all jurisdictions and all countries have been looking at how we can support the economy during this very difficult time. In Singapore, we've rolled out 4 budgets in I think the past 3 to 4 months, very unprecedented. We have set aside something like Singapore dollars, $193 billion, which is about 38% of our GDP. So not small by any means, but that just shows how much effort we are trying to do, what we're trying to do to make sure that Singapore is able to make it through this crisis. So next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, contact tracing is a very key part of how we are trying to tackle this disease. And we have used data quite extensively in this process. I've highlighted a few different initiatives we've put in place just to show how we are using data better, or how we're collecting certain types of data to enable this to happen. I think Trace Together might be something quite familiar to a lot of us. Singapore, you might know, was one of the first, in fact, possibly the first to launch this application, where we used Bluetooth protocols to identify people in close proximity with COVID patients. And the intention really was to be able to identify people that are in close contact with someone who was tested positive for COVID, and including people who that particular patient would not have known, strangers, for example, and that we can identify them quickly and sort of quarantine them so that the disease doesn't keep spreading. We also have another initiative called Safe Entry, which is essentially our national digital check-in system, and is in place in most of the venues of interest where we expect large crowds together. So these would be, say, supermarkets or even offices, for example, where people tend to gather for a prolonged period of time. And what it does, it essentially acts as a memory aid to enhance activity mapping by the contact tracers. And certainly, we also use the data that has been collected to map out, to have a visual understanding of how the disease has been moving, the patterns of the transmission, whether there's, it affects certain groups more, or there's certain high-risk settings we have to pay more attention to. We have a network analysis tool, and again, I don't think this is something just in Singapore. It's not unique to us. I think many countries have this as well. Next step, please. Next slide, please. One other area that we prize is also getting the community involved in managing or tackling COVID as well. And to do that, what we've tried to do from a data perspective anyway, is to put out more information so that the community or individuals can take the steps that they need to protect themselves or to protect the people around them. So we have launched something called Space Out, which is essentially a real-time dashboard that shows the crowdedness or the crowd levels at various places of interest, so malls, for example, so that Singaporeans can decide whether or not they really want to visit that place, knowing that there are a lot of people there, or they could visit it at a time that's less busy, and the probability or the likelihood, the risk of contracting the disease might be lower. We also embarked on a mask provision exercise. So I think there were 2 exercises so far, where the Singapore government provisioned a number of masks for each household. Singaporeans had to go and collect it, and we had a website that showed them quite clearly where to do so, when they could do it, again, in a very safe distance way of doing it. So again, one of the ways we are trying to put out data there so that people can take the requisite actions to protect themselves. Next slide, please. We did talk a little bit about, how we are providing some social support to the economy, or to businesses, to individuals as well. So one key example was a newly set up outfit called the National Jobs Council, chaired by our Senior Minister Tharman. Its mission is to create jobs and training opportunities during this difficult time, and I think we have promised that we would create 100,000 jobs or training opportunities to tide our people through this difficult period. And to do so, to be able to make sure we design these programs or initiatives well, we do have to pull together data and analyze them. So for example, whether there's stress in the labor market, what are the types of job vacancies that are available, how do we make sure we are able to get people to look at the jobs and apply, or we are able to target the right people as well. Next slide, please. So one of the things I think that we had started doing even prior to COVID was to set up the foundations to enable data to flow securely across the government. I think what Francisco mentioned was really true, that government agencies, all of us, tend to work in silos. And we had put in some concerted effort to try and ensure that these silos, we could break these silos or overcome these silos as far as possible. So sometime in 2018, we drafted new provisions in the Public Sector Governance Act, which made quite clear how we would share data among agencies. So what were the circumstances by which we could share data? And on top of that, because we are sharing data, we're sharing more data across the agency lines, we were quite clear that we needed to have stronger accountability measures as well. So we enacted provisions to criminalize acts of misuse of data or unauthorized disclosure of data, in fact, and including attempts to re-identify anonymized data. So any individual or any public officer that does these things willfully could be subject to a $5,000 penalty, that's Singapore dollars, of course, or up to 2 years in prison, in fact. So it's a pretty strong deterrent measure. But we didn't just put that in legislation. We also created something called the Government Data Architecture. We've launched it last year, sometime in October. It comes with organizational constructs and processes to enable the flow of data across government silos. So what we did was to appoint what we call single sources of truth that will be in charge of certain types of data, be in charge of maintaining the quality of this data, and to be able to provide it to the other agencies upon request. We also have what we call trusted centers. These are intermediaries that will fuse such data, de-identify the data, and then distribute it to the agencies that require such data for policy analysis. And I think you can see on the slide, our aim is really to reduce the time taken for data to flow from anywhere from 6 to 13 months to something like 7 working days. And I have to say, in the past few months, we have managed to come somewhat close to it. The last pillar that we did the last year or so was to have a very comprehensive review of how we are securing data within the government. And as was mentioned by a couple of the panelists earlier, the idea of we are trying to use data more pervasively, we still need to make sure that data is protected. We need to make sure that individuals' confidentiality is well protected and safeguarded, and the data remains safe even as we use it more pervasively. And so that really was the intent of this review, to put in recommendations that make sure that we shore up our security measures, and we can do this in a very, very concerted way. Next slide, please. And of course, I think, but not everything is perfect or ideal. In fact, it's far from it, and challenges remain. And some of these challenges really are brought to the fore during this COVID crisis. While we have put in place all these foundational enablers, we've realized it's not sufficient. The scale perhaps is not as sufficient as large as we need it to be. There's still many silos within the government. The pace of which data is flowing and the barriers to flowing the data flows are still there. We still need more processes, infrastructure to overcome these data flows, these barriers or these hurdles. Some of the data that we've been collecting so far, we collected mainly for administrative purposes. Not everything is fit for purpose directly for this COVID situation. So we've had to figure out how to use proxies, how to work around this data to understand the COVID situation better. And I think it was mentioned earlier as well that public trust remains really important. And how do we make sure that the public still continues to have confidence in how the government manages its data while we are trying to use it more pervasively for managing the public health situation and ensuring that individuals and the businesses get the help that they need. So yeah, this is I think this is my last slide. So I've tried to give a bit of an overview of how we are trying to tackle COVID, how we've used data, and some of the challenges that we're still trying to grapple with. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Sue Lin. Yes, you have that familiar feeling of slight awe and enviousness when we look at how Singapore handles these things. Just quickly to address this question from Simon Kopak, will these slides be available afterwards? Yes, we'll make all of the slides available along with a recording of the full the webinar when we publish our report, and you should receive a link to that. Meanwhile, if we can finally hear from Alistair, please.
Yes, so thank you so much to Matt, Maria, and the forum for hosting me here today. So Australia's basically been in a bit of a sense of crisis for about the last 6 months. We had probably a bit more than that. We had the bushfires at the end of last year, which caused untold damage to a lot of our natural environment, and that quickly morphed into COVID. And the one commonality throughout that whole thing has been the use of data and the use of data to actually drive better decisions. When COVID was starting to become an issue, what the Prime Minister asked me and my team to do is really go down and say, how can we use data to inform and assist better decision making? So in a sense, I come from a bit of a different perspective to many of us here. I'm not a data governance expert. I kind of run a team of analysts, and we try and use information from across government, across the world, across different businesses and industries to produce a kind of a full picture for the Prime Minister and for First Ministers in order to make better decisions on COVID. So I think there's a couple of lessons that I think apply no matter whether it was kind of us dealing with the bushfires or whether it was us dealing with COVID. And so I'd kind of like to share a couple of those today. The first one being is that the benefit of having a common operating picture is just so very important when we actually kind of give data to decision makers. One of the things that we struggled with early on in bushfires is that we had many of the debates were actually about the data. They're actually about the facts, whether something was burnt or not, whether something was more affected or not, whether a town was kind of at lower risk or greater risk. And so actually rushing to get a common operating picture was one of the lessons that we took out of the bushfire crisis. And we took that into COVID. And so one of the things that we did was create a common operating picture for all decision makers across government and across private sector. We shared that on a daily basis, and we still do share that on a daily basis. So everyone is actually singing from the same song sheet and actually have an understanding of what is the state of the coronavirus in Australia. The second one, and we worked this out quite early on, and I'm actually quite thankful for it, is we found out that forecasting became a bit of a mug's game in the sense that we could kind of run as much forecasting, but we really weren't using up-to-date data to run those forecasts. So we're only as good as the data that we're using. So what we said to the Prime Minister is we're going to not forecast, we're going to do a thing called nowcasting. We're going to be trying to give you as up-to-the-minute picture about what the data tells us as possible. And so that's kind of using a lot of things like what Ronald has been talking about and Mark about kind of some of these experimental data sets and saying, look, we won't have the official data from our equivalent of the ONS for maybe another couple of weeks, but we've got these 3 partial indicators and we think that these are representative. And so actually that was really important early on and still is quite important, particularly as we're moving from a coronavirus response phase to a recovery phase. I think the third thing and the last lesson that I think we learned is that it's so important to actually have the analysts in the room. many of us, including myself, have actually struggled for many years about kind of saying, as data leaders, we're the data translators as well. But one of the things that we found really useful is actually taking the analysts to the meetings, just to give them a better understanding about kind of the products that they produce, how they're actually using a practical basis, and how they actually can drive better decisions. And our analysts have found that really, really useful. It's kind of been a bit of an experiment. It's sometimes been a bit hit and miss, but we found it really useful because the analysts are the ones that are able to do the work, are able to kind of interpret the strategic operating environment, and with our assistance as data leaders, produce good products that can drive better decisions. So I think that kind of gives you a bit of an understanding of what we've been doing here in Australia. But I'm really looking forward to this panel discussion and any questions that come from it.
Thank you very much indeed. We've got half an hour. Let's think first actually about if I could get brief answers to a question about where the unrealised potential is. Because we've had some really interesting examples of where people are using data to address COVID and its impact. I suppose we're at a fairly early stage, unfortunately, of this crisis, where the focus has been on perhaps public health, medical interventions. The economic and social stuff is probably going to come along now and soon. I wonder if, can you identify any areas in which you think there is much more potential to use data, and that we'll have to build those capabilities and systems as we go on? Does anybody want to start on that one?
Yeah, if I start on this, thank you for that question, Matt. Very difficult question.
Yes.
The way, I mean, from let's say the framework of the statistics and related also a little bit to earlier remarks of not working in silos, to combine data sets. I think that's where there's still a lot of potential there, which we haven't used. So there are a lot of different data sets out there, but the way we use them one by one, and fill in parts of the picture. If we can get these cross links between all of these data sets, for instance, in a geospatial setting, I think that's where we combining statistics and geospatial data is some of the areas where we're really trying to see if we can move forward on.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say the same, Matt. Diversity of data sets. I mean, we're all familiar with banks calling us about credit card fraud. They use different kind of data sets, whether it's kind of looking for fraud or even looking at modernising transport policy to take advantage of electric scooters, which is something we're grappling with in the UK. You know, you need data to modernise policy, and the more diversity of those data sets, and obviously the more up to date, the better.
Right. Anybody else got an area where you think we'll have to expand capabilities as the crisis evolves?
For me, it's probably the real-time nature, because often governments have to make decisions quickly, and they'll be making those decisions quickly anyway. They may as well be making those decisions with 20% of the story in front of them, because the counter to that is they make decisions with 0% of the story in front of them. So we kind of need to be able to kind of phrase and work up how we actually best represent these high-frequency real-time data sets that might not tell the full picture, but might at least be really helpful in telling some of the picture.
Thank you very much. Susan or Francisco, you don't have to answer this one, but have you any thoughts?
Yeah, no, so actually I think that the previous speakers probably touched on what resonated with me a lot. I think the idea of putting the data sets together, that's something that we are also trying to see how we can do better in, what we can do better in. I think we have been using data very, very specific to specific use cases, or, you know, it's been a very one-to-one or one-to, you know, we've always collected data for a specific thing and we just use it at that. I think as we're moving into recovery phase and we're trying to see how we can, you know, boost the economy better or help our citizens better, I think we need to pull together different data sets to be able to understand the situations a lot better, rather than it's not just a focus on specifically curbing transmission of COVID-19, which has been our which has been taking up all our attention so far.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Francesco?
I would just add a particular sector that I think it might be aligned with your question in terms of unrealized potential, is that jobs are definitely not going to be the same after the pandemic, and many companies are not going to create the same jobs that were creating before the pandemic, and I think there's a lot of potential there in terms of analyzing data that the economy from the company side, in terms of the capacities that they're updating and needing, and also on the labor force in terms of the many skills and competencies that are out there and that are not mapped, and that I would say are crucial to start to answer the question of a new market fit in terms of what organizations need and what people can offer.
Thank you. That question looked ahead a bit. Actually, just want a question on where we are now. I mean, what are the obstacles and weaknesses that currently prevent or make it difficult for governments to make full use of existing public sector data sets? If I can ask you just to name one of the key problems that we find inside governments, and a way that the situation could be improved. I don't know, Ronald, have you seen your overview of how it's happening around the world? Do you see any common factors?
Yeah, I think I'll try to answer the question. I hope we get the national view on this. But from the outside looking in, I mean, we've talked about already like a kind of a multi-stakeholder approach, but also working across government is not always easy. So if you work with different government administrations to share data there, sometimes as difficult as sharing it with civil society or private sector. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I think legislation is catching up. I think I heard Francesco say that there's work going on in that sense in Chile. Yes, I think that there is at the moment like this momentum of being able to work more closely, and I hope that momentum can be taken forward to situations other than COVID-19. So that's where I hope. I think like Sulin mentioned, is lock-in gains for the future, and that's one of them. Is that currently a lot of things are possible, and I hope that the kind of ways in which we have been working together within government, also across the different departments, will also continue in the future. Back to you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. Francesco, any comments on that one?
Yes, I would say that your question is really difficult to choose one obstacle, because there are several. But I would choose that it's really important to have leadership from public servants to show the value of platforms in opposition to silos, and because that value should be positive and big for almost all of the stakeholders. But that requires leadership and breaking some walls. And that, yeah, that's it. I would choose that one.
Thank you. Mark, I don't know if you've observed in working with different governments.
Well, in addition to that, I like the term, you've got to liberate the data. Securely, of course, with all the things around it, but liberate it and also curate it, i.e. the quality of it. But don't be over, as Alistair said, you're getting 80% of a view is better than having no view at all. Clinicians diagnose diseases on me with a probably 80, 90% certainty, but they decide on I might decide to go ahead with that procedure. No one knows exactly, but that's a good enough. And so quite often 80, 90% is good enough and certainly better than nothing. So liberate it, curate it, and be prepared to look broadly, different data sets and get the best possibly you can. It will never be 100%.
Thank you. Celine.
So I mentioned earlier that in Singapore we've had this concerted attempt and effort to start using data much more widely, make much better use of the data in the public sector. And I talked about the government data architecture very, very lightly, and I think I agree. We put all those things in place because of all the challenges we were facing. And I think those challenges, while we have managed to sort of address them, we still have some ways to move. So for example, I think what we really wanted to overcome initially was the mindset that data belonged to a specific organization, and the conservative attitudes with regard to allowing other agencies to be able to use it. And so that was something we really had to put in place, and that's why we had to enact the provisions in the Public Sector Governance Act to make sure people were assured that that could be done legally, and that accountability flowed with the data. So that was a very key principle that we put in place, that accountability flowed with the data. The second thing I think that was also touched on was not only did we put the policy and the regulation in place, we've been trying to deal with the infrastructure and the platforms, so the hardware to support the policy and the regulation as well. We've just started, I think, and I think there's a long way to go for us. What we've tried to do is to focus on what we call core data. So we talked about improving quality, and we completely agree with that. So we've been focusing on data sets which we think are much more important across the government, and focusing our efforts in improving the quality therein of those data sets, rather than trying to boil the ocean at one time. So that's sort of how we've been moving. But I would say that given that we've just started launching it, we just launched it not that long ago, we still have some way to go in trying to instill this culture within the government, that this is something that data is to be used, is not just the asset of one organization, but actually it can be used as a common resource for the government to serve the citizens better. But we have to do it in a very secure and in a very responsible way. And those are the things that we're also putting in place. So I would say one thing that we need to change, we still need to work on, at least within Singapore, is getting agencies or getting our organizations to recognize that data can be used beyond just their own organization, and that they should not be so conservative about protecting it or keeping it to themselves. It's again breaking down the silos, as mentioned previously. And I think I had one last point, but I think the good thing of, well, I shouldn't say COVID is a good thing, but essentially I think again it brought to fore that data is extremely important in how we're trying to manage the COVID situation. So we have seen that organizations or our agencies have started taking a different mental model towards how we use data, how data can be liberated, how data can be used within the public sector, and I think that's something we really do want to continue to capture, to continue. We don't want to let that momentum go to waste, and we want to make sure we are able to to institutionalize this for future gains as well. So yes, that would be my somewhat shortish, not very long answer.
Thank you, Alistair. An obstacle and a solution.
So, I think it's actually, as a data community, we often kind of get attracted to the cool new things. And there's obviously a really great role for AI, machine learning, etc. But what we found most useful, and what we found decision makers have found most useful in the COVID environment, is actually really simple things that often aren't that much analytical strength, but actually kind of are just really useful. what was a metric pre-COVID? What is it now? What was it last month? And how are we tracking? What is the scoreboard saying? And so that's not stuff is often not that complex. Often not even really using anything but percentage change, but actually really useful for decision makers. So often we overcomplicate issues as opposed to going, what is the actual data that needs to be presented to decision makers for them to make a better decision? And sometimes that's a really, really simple kind of chart of this is what something was before COVID, this is what it is now.
Thank you. We have 15 minutes. I just want to quickly ask one final question then around public trust, which is key to people being willing to share their data. People have got to be confident in how government's going to use their data, in how government's going to store it, and in how government is perhaps going to share it with other organisations. If we could ask just sort of one of the ways in which governments can build confidence, and perhaps, if you wish, also behaviours which weaken it and should be avoided. Perhaps Ronald?
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's a real important question. I mean, trust is the basis for the way in which people accept and deal and build policies. So if there's no trust in the data, that would be a real issue. Trust has been a key cornerstone of the work of national statistical agencies from the beginning. I mean, they've been accessing population census and tax data and things like that. So they have experience in that. So, but keeping the trust is important, and it has to be open and transparent to public how things are being done. There are a number of ways in which statistical officers want to do that. One of the things there also is also even if we put out experimental data, we have to have a minimum level of quality in there, so also that the trust in the numbers itself is guaranteed. And then I think more and more we have to make use of privacy preserving techniques. And that's an area which is evolving fast, with use of encryption, multi-party computation, all kinds of measures in which you can use the data without actually identifying individual records, or identifying, or so de-identification of information. There is a lot of work going on there. It should be incorporated in the common practice, and also be communicated well to the public how that is done, so that people know that data are being used for the benefit of society, and not to impose anything else. Thank you.
Thank you. Francisco?
Yes. I would say one of the things that weaken public trust is not addressing the topic in terms of what happens with a citizen's data. And one thing that really would and would help to make progress in that is really to have a sense of urgency in terms of putting up an architecture and products that can ensure the citizen to see what's happened with their data. And ourselves in Chile have been in the last year putting a lot of effort on that in terms of an architecture of interoperability and data exchange that can give us that floor, you know. Also there's a thing around I think transparency of standards of transparency in terms of and a bit of education or talking about this topic around something that said also Sulin, that who's the owner of the data, the piece of data, because many public servants, like, because they have the faculties of managing or administrating a set of data, can assume as well that they are the owners of the data, and that's a big confusion that makes a lot of harm.
Thank you. Mark, I suppose you're in a slightly different position. It's the governments that have to maintain trust of the people, but I suppose you need to maintain the trust of the governments in holding their data.
Well, we need to maintain trust of every customer, whether it's a government entity, a bank, a commercial entity, because as soon as we break that, we're basically out of business. So, of course, there's huge amounts of technology we put into this. We lay our own cables around the world with ships. We build our own hardware. We encrypt every single bit of data, emotional invest, no matter whose it is. That's how serious we take this, and our customers can choose where to locate their data, and we'll put that into a contract. So, we put this at the very front of everything, because as a global cloud provider, you're out of business if you lose trust. And for example, if you, and we do, comply with GDPR in Europe, it's like a high watermark. We have to comply, therefore, with GDPR globally, because it's a global cloud. So whatever compliance regulation you comply with, no matter where it is or what it is in the world, everyone will comply with it, whether they want it or not. So this is a huge subject for us, and we take it extremely seriously, Matt.
Thank you. Sulin, are you any comments on this issue around building and maintaining trust?
Well, it's a constant issue that we are grappling with. I think I can share a specific example. So when we first launched the Trace Together app, I think it was new. People were wondering what it was all about, whether it was we were collecting things or data that they didn't want us to collect, whether we were collecting their location, tracking where they were moving. So we had we had to grapple with reactions against Trace Together. And more recently, we've also launched a standalone device called Trace Together Token, which is supposed to be a version that's to help those who do not have smartphones, who are unable to access Trace Together application itself or the app itself. So what we tried to do recently was to, rather than just talk about it, I think we tried to demonstrate it. So we've open sourced the Blue Trace protocol that underpins Trace Together. We've also organized a teardown session for the Trace Together token, so that experts could look at it to tear it apart and see whether we really were putting where our money, doing exactly what we said we would do. And in that process, we managed to pull in advocates as well. And these are experts who could speak with a lot of credibility to the public, and so those different initiatives helped. I would say that when we started out with some of our communications, I think we tend to err on the side of either overwhelming people with too much information or not really providing the information that people want. So I think we're still calibrating how we ensure we sort of address the specific concerns that people have. So I thought, rather than talking about broader issue, I give you a bit of an example of what we've been doing so far and things that we're still trying to improve on. I think it's an ongoing exercise. Public confidence is something that can be easily dampened with just one or two mistakes, and it takes a long time to build it up again. So we're very careful about how we manage it. We're very careful about what we say, and we do exactly what we say. And that to me is what Ronald mentioned. It's public trust is the cornerstone of us to be able to use the data wisely.
Thank you. Alistair?
So we often think about data trust as a kind of a data policy question. I like to think of it as also as a service delivery question. We did a bit of work here about 18 months ago, which found that people who are satisfied with government services online were about twice as likely to trust government. And that's really important. If you can actually produce a good product as government that is actually kind of useful for, I keep telling my team, useful for like the single parent or the person that's going through a tumultuous time of their life that actually has to deal with government. If you can provide a good service, then people are more likely to trust government. So if there's anything that we can do to help it, I think it's actually we need to be better at service delivery through digital services.
Thank you. Well, we're nearly out of time. I'm going to save a couple of minutes at the end for one final question to each of you, but let's just do a quick fire from audience questions that have come into individuals. For example, Austin Kometic asks Sue Lynn, the application that informs citizens which areas of the city are most busy, have you identified any impact of that in terms of reducing the spread of the virus?
I think honestly we haven't quite determined the impact of it, or I don't think we are able to attribute any change or any improvements or effectiveness of how we've curbed the transmission specifically to that one application. I think the way Singapore does it is we have many different initiatives at the same time, all of which work together in tandem and they complement each other. So I wouldn't be able to say definitively that this contributed, specifically to how people have changed their movements, etc. I do know anecdotally people have given a lot of feedback that's been useful, that's been interesting to see, and it's been useful for them to plan when do they want to visit a shop and when do they want to go out to a certain location. But I don't have specific statistics on that, unfortunately. All this talk about data so far.
Yes, thank you. And there's a question from Susanna Giacchero, public health analyst at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the USA, who asks of Alistair, of your nowcasting work. She'd like to hear more. Essentially, I'd ask on that, where do you draw this data from, and how do you then present it to ministers with appropriate caveats?
We draw it from wherever we can get it. We're actually not fussed. If we actually have to go out and ask for if we have to cold call a company and say, look, you say you've got this data set, or you're a kind of a fast food chain and we're really interested in about kind of how many cars are passing through certain locations an hour, we literally just call them up and we ask. And we find that companies are actually kind of often amazed to be approached by government in a kind of a proactive manner. So often they're very happy to share. But in terms of actually how we present it, that's actually where all the biggest challenge is, because a bank can share anonymized transaction records of 1 million customers with us, but it's what we do with it that actually kind of makes a difference. We actually have to kind of spend enough time with the data, and particularly saying, look, we'll never know, as a data team, we'll never know as much about a bank's data transactions as their actual data team. So we kind of very much leverage off their expertise and say, look, you as the data custodians and data owners already own this data. We will work with you. We often don't even want the confidentialized unit record files. We just want to kind of work with you on a few outputs that you will regularly report to us, and then we'll kind of present that and fuse that with our other data sets. Often we love the idea as data gurus, we love the idea of saying, oh yes, we've got access to 1 million records, but what does it actually mean? If we can actually work with the private sector and work with others to actually kind of get the 3 or 4 outputs that we actually want from those 1 million records, we find that's a much better strategy.
Thank you very much. I have 1 minute. I'm going to run over about a minute and a half. If each of you provides an answer in just 30 seconds to the question, could you name a single change you would like to see that would improve government's ability to apply data and tackle COVID? And we'll refer to the previous order. Ronald.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So one single thing. I like the statistical community to stay involved in these fast indicators to inform policies. I think one of the things which is happening in ONS and could happen in other countries is that they've actively starting to put data science across government and see that feeds into making better use of available data. And I can see that as something for other countries to go forward with. Thanks.
Thank you. That's the fast sort of data quality standards. Francisco.
Yes, I would say one big change that needs to happen is to set the conditions to migrate to the cloud massively. A second one would be really trying to make the language of big data and AI and machine learning much more friendly and much more able to meet people where they are and setting. I mean, not forgetting that it's all about how you manage information, and that's something everyone and every organization does every day. And I work on leadership on how to break silos.
Thank you. Matt?
Well, Matt, you'd expect me to say embrace cloud technology, of course. Don't be afraid of it. It's mature technology now. It's very proven. It's been around for many years now, that decade. So it's not just new, but embrace it. It will enable you to run very scalable, very secure environments that can adapt very quickly to situations like this. And I think that's the biggest challenge that the world has faced with COVID. It was unforeseen and has not been seen in this generation. The last time the world saw a pandemic, the technology and computers didn't exist. So I think that would be my message.
Thank you. Celia?
For me, I think what I'd like to see more of is more public-private sector collaboration. I think that we have been, at least in Singapore, we've been focused very much on very public sector government data, and I think that there's a lot of unrealized potential with in partnerships with the private sector, whether it's from a data perspective or some kind of collaboration on how we can have new initiatives. So that's something I think we should be embracing more. And hopefully that's something that we can engender post in COVID and then and institutionalize thereafter.
Thank you. And Alistair?
I think we just need to value simplicity over coolness, and we need to kind of every data set that we every piece of analysis, we need to work out how we can actually present really complex things really simply. The world map's incredibly complex, but it's on one page. We need to work out how can we actually sum up our great analysis on one page and present that to decision makers so they can make better decisions. Because dealing with ministers, dealing with PMs, they're very busy people. You basically have one page to make your pitch.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry I've taken 3 minutes of all of your time extra. I apologise to you and to the audience for that, but I really thank you very much indeed to all of our panellists for all of the contributions. Thank you to the audience for watching. We hope you found the discussions interesting and useful. We'll be publishing a report on this session and we'll distribute that to the audience along with the slides and the recording. And yes, thank you very much indeed to everybody. Goodbye and stay safe.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank
you, Matt.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.